I never imagined that the body I carried for 63 years, the body that bore scars from childbirth arthritis and all the quiet wars of living, would become something my own child saw as currency. When you give life, when you bring a son into this world, you imagine he will be the one holding your hand in the hospital room when your last breath comes, not the one pushing you toward the operating table for a profit. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you everything the way it unfolded, because even now, when I close my eyes at night, the memories come rushing back like a tide that never lets me rest. My name is Marisol Johnson. I am 63 years old, an African-American woman who spent most of her life in a small town outside of Denver, Colorado. My husband Victor passed away nearly a decade ago. He was the kind of man who worked himself to the bone, who never complained about double shifts at the steel plant, who made sure there was always food on the table, even if it meant his hands bled from labor. When he died, I thought the grief would drown me, but I held on for our son Daniel. He was 22 back then, fresh out of college, standing at the graveside, with tears streaking down his cheeks and his shoulders hunched in a way that made him look like a little boy again. I promised myself that day that I would do everything in my power to protect him, to carry him through the storm the way Victor would have wanted. For years, that promise shaped every decision I made. I sold my jewelry when Daniel needed money for graduate school. I took out loans against the house to help him start his business. I cut corners on groceries, patched up old clothes, skipped doctor appointments for myself, all so that my son could live a life unburdened by the struggles that defined mine. I thought that was love. I thought that was what mothers were meant to do, to give and give and give again until there was nothing left. But I didn't realize that when you teach someone that your sacrifices are infinite, they begin to believe you are infinite too, that your body, your soul, your very existence are just extensions of their need. It started with a phone call. I remember it because the day was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that clings to the walls after a heavy snowstorm. My phone rang, and when I saw Daniel's name flashing on the screen, I smiled. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling, "I need you." I was already halfway to grabbing my coat before I even asked what was wrong. He told me he was sick, that his kidneys were failing, that the doctor said he needed a transplant. My heart shattered, but at the same time, there was no hesitation in me. If my son's body was betraying him, then mine would step in to carry him. That's what mothers do. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and despair, but when I walked into Daniel's room and saw him lying there pale and exhausted, I felt only determination. I held his hand and told him not to worry, that I would fix everything. His wife Jessica stood beside him, her face tight and unreadable, like she'd rehearsed every expression before I entered. She thanked me, but the words didn't warm. I brushed it off. After all, not everyone knows how to handle fear. Families break in different ways under pressure. The tests began needles and scans and endless questions. When the doctor came back and said I was a match, I cried tears of joy. It felt like God's hand had reached down, offering us a lifeline. I thanked him silently for giving me the chance to save my boy. But what I didn't know, what no mother should ever have to imagine, was that in that same moment, my son was plotting something unspeakable. There were whispers in the hallways. Papers slid across desks faster than I could read them. I signed forms, trusting Daniel and Jessica when they told me it was just hospital protocol. I didn't think twice. I was too focused on the image of my son waking up healthy, of his skin no longer gray, of his laugh returning to our home. It wasn't until I overheard a hushed conversation between Jessica and a man in a suit that the first crack formed in my faith. They stood just outside the cafeteria, their voices low but urgent. I caught phrases money-wired she doesn't know keep her calm. My stomach clenched. My first instinct was denial. Surely they weren't talking about me. Surely my son, my Daniel, the baby I nursed through fevers and nightmares, wouldn't keep secrets from me. I told myself to let it go. Stress does strange things to the mind. But the truth has a way of gnawing at the edges until you can't look away. The night before the scheduled surgery, a nurse came into my room with papers for me to sign again. I skimmed them this time, and that's when I saw it language that didn't just authorize a donation, but also waived my rights over any compensation tied to the transaction. My hand froze. Transaction. The word leapt off the page like a knife to my chest. I asked the nurse what it meant, but she looked uncomfortable, mumbled something about legal departments, and left me alone with the silence. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake in the stiff hospital bed, listening to the hum of machines trying to reconcile the image of my sweet boy with the possibility that he had signed me away like property. At dawn, I confronted him. His eyes darted to Jessica before they met mine. He sighed heavy and frustrated like I was the one disappointing him. "Mom," he said, "this is bigger than you. We needed the money. Jessica's family invested everything into my business and it's failing. This deal, it saves all of us." My ears rang. My knees went weak. I wanted to believe I misunderstood, but the words kept tumbling out of him sharp and cold. He admitted that he had agreed to sell not just my kidney, but my consent as though it were his to barter. The hospital, the lawyers, Jessica's family, they were all in on it. My body was the collateral for his second chance, not at life, but at wealth. I can't describe the betrayal in words that are big enough. It wasn't just a broken promise. It was a severing of something sacred. I looked at my son and saw not the boy I raised, but a stranger wearing his face. He reached for my hand, begging me to understand, to forgive, to go through with it. "You'll still be saving me," he whispered. But I pulled away. For the first time in my life, I saw the limits of a mother's love, not because it ran out, but because it had been twisted into something unrecognizable. That morning, I signed no papers. I demanded a lawyer. Jessica screamed at me in the hallway, calling me selfish, accusing me of destroying their future. Daniel just stared, his eyes dark with a fury I had never seen. He told me if I walked away, I wasn't his mother anymore. I felt the words burn into me, but I stood tall. For 63 years, I had carried everyone else's burdens. For once, I chose myself. The fallout was brutal. They tried to corner me with threats of lawsuits, whispers of institutionalization, claims that I was too old, too fragile to make decisions. But I had one thing: they underestimated the truth. The lawyer I hired uncovered the entire scheme, every dirty detail of how they planned to profit from my flesh. The hospital panicked, the investors backed away, and suddenly, Daniel and Jessica were left exposed. My son's reputation crumbled, his business dissolved, and the community that once praised him now whispered about betrayal and greed. And me, I went home to an empty house filled with silence and memories. I grieved not just for the boy I lost, but for the part of myself that had lived only for him. I sat at the kitchen table where I once served him pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, and I wept until my chest hurt. But with every tear, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I saw myself not just as a mother, but as a woman who deserved dignity, who deserved more than to be carved up for someone else's gain. I don't know if I'll ever fully heal from what Daniel did. The scars aren't just on my heart, they are in my very bones. But I know this betrayal can destroy you, or it can free you. And though my son tried to sell me, what he really gave me was a chance to reclaim my life. to stop giving everything away and start holding something back for myself. I woke up the next morning in my own bed, sunlight spilling through the curtains, my chest still raw from sobbing through the night. The house felt emptier than ever, and yet for the first time in years, I could breathe without someone else's expectations pressing down on me. The weight of betrayal was heavy, yes, but beneath it, something unexpected stirred a quiet, defiant strength I hadn't felt since I was a young woman, standing on my own 2 feet. I sat at the kitchen table, my fingers tracing the grooves of the wood grooves carved by decades of family meals, laughter, and arguments. It struck me that this table had seen everything. The birthday candles I lit for Daniel, the nights Victor and I whispered about bills, the mornings I packed lunches for school. And now it bore witness to a truth I could no longer ignore. Love without respect is not love at all. I didn't hear from Daniel for weeks. The silence was its own kind of torment. Part of me longed for him to call, to apologize, to show up at my door and fall into my arms the way he used to after a scraped knee or a broken toy. But another part of me, the part that had stayed awake in that hospital bed, realizing he'd seen me as a transaction, knew better. My son had chosen his path, and it was paved with choices I could never understand. I busied myself with small things, tending the garden Victor once loved, reading books I had put off for years, even joining a walking group of women my age. At first, I felt like a fraud, smiling and nodding, while inside I was shattered. But with each step I took, with every laugh, I shared a little piece of me stitched itself back together. And then one afternoon, a letter arrived. I recognized Daniel's handwriting, instantly messy, slanted a rush of ink like he couldn't slow down enough to write neatly. My hands trembled as I opened it. The words were short, almost clipped. He didn't apologize. Instead, he accused me again of ruining his life, of choosing pride over family, of turning my back on him when he needed me most. But there was one line that cut deeper than all the others. "You owe me. You've always owed me." I sat staring at those words until the paper blurred with my tears. How could he believe that had all my sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the scraped-together tuition, the meals skipped so he could eat, added up to debt in his eyes? My love had been a gift, not a contract. But to him, it was never enough. That night, I dreamed of Victor. He stood at the foot of our bed, just as he had in life, his hands tucked into his work jacket, his eyes full of quiet strength. In the dream, he didn't speak, but I felt his presence steadying me, reminding me of who I was before grief and betrayal consumed me. When I woke, the dream lingered like the warmth of a hand on my shoulder. It gave me courage. I realized then that this wasn't just about Daniel's betrayal. It was about all the years I had allowed myself to be erased piece by piece, until there was nothing left but what others demanded of me. I made an appointment with the lawyer again, not to pursue more legal action Daniel's schemes had already unraveled in public, but to put my own house in order. I rewrote my will carefully, deliberately. I wanted to ensure that the life Victor and I built brick by brick would not be squandered by ungrateful hands. I thought long and hard about who deserved to inherit the small legacy we had left. In the end, I left the bulk of it to charity, specifically a foundation for single mothers struggling to raise children on their own. It felt poetic in a way. My sacrifices, my pain, would become someone else's lifeline, but this time by my choice, not through manipulation or coercion. Word of my decision spread faster than I expected. A cousin called me asking if it was true. A neighbor mentioned that Jessica had been ranting on social media about my betrayal of the family. Betrayal, that word again thrown at me like a stone. Funny how quickly it turned into a weapon against me, as though refusing to be exploited made me the villain. But instead of shrinking under the judgment, I felt lighter. Let them talk. For once, I wasn't living for their approval. Months passed. I poured my energy into volunteering at a community center downtown. They're surrounded by children with wide eyes and mothers with tired smiles. I found a strange kind of healing. One girl, maybe 12 years old, reminded me of Daniel, when he was little, curious, eager, quick to laugh. She asked me once why I spent so much time there. I told her, because sometimes giving love where it's truly wanted is how we find our way back to ourselves. She hugged me, and in that simple gesture, I felt something in me soften, as if the wound was beginning to scar over. But healing doesn't erase pain. It only makes room for it to live beside hope. And pain has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. One rainy evening, as I locked up the center, I saw Daniel standing by my car. He looked thinner. His clothes rumpled, his eyes hollow. For a moment, my heart lurched. I saw the boy. He had been the one I'd held through storms. But then he spoke. His words were slurred, his voice bitter. He asked for money. Not forgiveness, not a second chance money. I told him no. My voice shook, but I stood firm. His face twisted, anger flaring. He called me heartless, accused me of abandoning him. The rain poured harder, plastering his hair to his forehead, and I thought of all the times I had shielded him from the storm. Not this time. I turned, unlocked my car, and drove away, tears blurring the windshield. My chest ached as though something inside me had cracked open again, but beneath the ache was clarity. Sometimes love means saying yes, but sometimes the truest love is having the courage to say no. That night, lying awake, I realized Daniel may never understand. He may never see the truth of what he did to me, to us. And I had to learn to live with that. Betrayal doesn't always come with closure. Sometimes the people who wound you most carry on believing they were right. The only closure you get is the one you give yourself. And so, I chose to close the chapter. Not with forgiveness, not yet, but with acceptance. I couldn't change Daniel's choices. I couldn't rewrite what he had done. But I could choose how much more of my life I gave to his shadow. I started writing in a journal every day, pouring my grief and rage and tiny sparks of hope onto paper. In those pages, I spoke to the woman I used to be, the woman who gave everything away without question. I told her she mattered. I told her she deserved peace. And slowly, word by word, I began to believe it. Spring came, and with it, the smell of lilacs in my backyard blooming against the fence Victor had built 30 years ago. I stood there one morning, coffee in hand, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something like calm. The ache of betrayal hadn't left me. It never would, but it no longer defined every breath I took. It was strange, almost unsettling, to feel my life widening again, after being trapped inside grief and anger for so long. But life, I've learned, doesn't let you rest when the storm still has one more wave to deliver. It happened on a Wednesday, a day I'll never forget. I was folding laundry when the phone rang. A nurse's voice clipped, and professional told me Daniel was in the hospital again. His body had deteriorated quickly since the failed transplant plan, and now he was critical. My knees buckled, and I had to sit down on the edge of the bed, the towel slipping from my hands. No matter what he had done to me, no matter how much he had twisted my love, he was still my son. I drove to the hospital in silence, the road stretching endlessly before me, memories flickering like ghosts on either side. Daniel as a baby clutching my finger. Daniel as a teenager storming out of the house after his first heartbreak. Daniel at Victor's funeral, his arms around me as we both cried into the same handkerchief. And Daniel in that hospital room months ago, telling me I owed him. My heart warred with itself the entire drive, When I walked into his room, I barely recognized him. His skin was pale, his lips cracked, his body thinner than I'd ever seen. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot, and for a moment I thought I saw the boy I raised. But then he opened his mouth, and instead of apology, instead of gratitude, came desperation. He begged me again, not for forgiveness, but for another chance at my kidney. The doctors had told him it was his last option, and he clung to it like a drowning man clings to driftwood. I stood frozen at the foot of his bed, my heart tearing itself apart. Part of me wanted to rush forward to hold him, to tell him yes, to save him again. But the other part remembered the papers. I almost signed the transaction he orchestrated, the way he saw me as a vessel rather than a person. And deeper still was the voice of survival, the one that whispered, "If you give in now, you'll lose yourself forever." I told him no. The word came out quiet, trembling, but once it was spoken, it filled the room. Daniel stared at me, disbelief turning to rage. He cursed me, called me a monster, said no mother could ever deny her child life. Each word hit me like a stone, but I stood my ground. My hands shook, but I held my chin high. "I gave you life once," I whispered, "but I will not let you take mine." Jessica stormed in, then her eyes blazing, accusing me of murder, of cruelty. She said I was selfish, that I cared more about punishing Daniel than saving him. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The nurses intervened, guiding me out of the room as Jessica's shouts echoed down the hallway. I walked out of that hospital feeling both heavier and lighter than I ever had. I knew the choice I made would haunt me, but I also knew it was the only choice that honored the truth of what had happened. Love doesn't mean allowing yourself to be destroyed. Sometimes love is drawing a line and refusing to cross it, even if it breaks you. Weeks passed. Daniel's condition worsened, and the updates came not from him, but from distant relatives or whispers in the community. I stayed away, though it tore me apart. One night, I lit a candle by Victor's photo and spoke aloud to him, asking if I had done the right thing. The silence that followed was unbearable, but deep down, I knew Victor would have wanted me to protect myself. And then the call came. Daniel was gone. The grief that struck me was nothing like what I expected. It wasn't clean, wasn't simple. It was tangled with guilt, anger, sorrow, and relief, all knotted together. I wept for the boy I once held, for the man he might have been, for the life cut short by choices too reckless to undo. But I also wept for myself, for the years I had given away, for the mother I had been, for the woman I was becoming. His funeral was small. Jessica barely looked at me. The pastor spoke of forgiveness, of redemption, but the words floated above me, unreachable. When it was over, I stood by his grave, long after everyone else had left, the wind cold against my face. I whispered a goodbye that felt both final and unfinished. In the months that followed, I wrestled with the silence he left behind. Some nights, I dreamed of him running into my arms as a child, and I woke up sobbing. Other nights, I dreamed of him signing those papers, and I woke up shaking with rage. Healing wasn't linear, it never is, but slowly through the ache, I began to find meaning in the ruins. I poured myself even deeper into the community center. I told my story carefully, anonymously at first, so that other women could see the dangers of giving until there is nothing left. I saw myself in their eyes, in their exhaustion, in their quiet yearning for recognition. And every time one of them thanked me, or hugged me, or simply nodded in understanding, I felt less alone. Daniel's betrayal will always be a scar one I carry with me in every breath. But scars are not just reminders of pain, they are proof of survival. And survival, I have come to believe, is its own kind of victory. The first anniversary of Daniel's death, arrived quietly, like a shadow slipping across the floor. I woke that morning to a strange heaviness in my chest, as though my body remembered the weight of grief before my mind had fully caught up. The calendar on the wall told me it had been 12 months since he left this earth, but my heart told me time doesn't move the same way when it comes to loss. Some wounds don't close, they just learn to live alongside you. I lit a candle the same way I had on his birthday the year before and placed it next to Victor's picture. I whispered their names into the silence, and for a moment, the room felt full of memories of love, of everything I had lost, and everything I had survived. Then I sat down and wrote in my journal, because words have always been the only way I can untangle the storm inside me. I wrote about the little boy who once clung to my leg on the first day of school, about the teenager who slammed doors when I told him no, about the man who broke my heart in ways I never imagined possible. I wrote about the ache of betrayal, the bitterness of rejection, and the quiet power of reclaiming myself. When I closed the journal, I felt lighter, as though putting those memories on paper freed me from carrying them alone. Not long after Jessica reached out. A short message, almost careless in tone. "We should talk." My stomach twisted. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let the past stay buried. But another part, the part that still sought answers, agreed to meet. We sat across from each other in a cafe downtown, the clink of dishes and hum of conversation filling the silence between us. She looked older, harder, her eyes tired in a way that spoke of battles I couldn't see. Her first words weren't what I expected. "I loved him," she said, her voice low. "But he was reckless. You weren't the only one he betrayed." She went on to tell me things I hadn't known: that Daniel had borrowed money from her family, that he had gambled away opportunities, that he'd lied to her, just as he'd lied to me. She admitted her role in the hospital scheme, but claimed she had only gone along because she thought it was the only way to save him. Her eyes searched mine, pleading for something: understanding maybe, or absolution. I listened, but I didn't offer forgiveness. Forgiveness is a gift, and I wasn't ready to give it. What I did offer was honesty. "We both lost him," I said, my voice shaking. "But don't mistake shared grief for shared guilt. He made his choices, and we made ours." She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes, and for a moment, I saw not the woman who had schemed against me, but a widow in her own right, mourning a man who had left destruction in his wake. We parted without promises, without friendship, but with something like closure. Life moved forward, as it always does. Seasons shifted, the garden bloomed, and withered, and bloomed again, and I found myself leaning more into the small joys that had once felt impossible. I joined a book club. I learned how to paint watercolors. I even started taking short trips to places Victor and I had always dreamed of visiting, but never had the time for. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had lost in the endless cycle of giving everything away. And yet Daniel was never far from my thoughts. His ghost lingered in the corners of the house, in the scent of old baseball gloves in the attic, in the laughter I swore I sometimes heard in the garden at dusk. But instead of crushing me, those memories began to soften. They became reminders not just of betrayal, but of love too, the kind of love that existed before everything unraveled. It was complicated, painful, but real. And maybe that was enough. One evening, as the sun set behind the Rockies, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold, I sat on the porch with my journal and tried to make sense of everything. I realized then that revenge, betrayal, and karma were just pieces of a larger story. The real story was about survival, about learning that even when those closest to us shatter our trust, we can still find a way to stand tall. I thought about the women at the community center, about the girl who once hugged me tight and asked why I gave my time so freely. I thought about the legacy I would leave, not in money or property, but in the strength of the lessons I had learned the hardest way possible. I want to tell you something. Something I wish someone had told me years ago. Love is not measured by how much you give up. True love respects boundaries, honors dignity, and sees the person behind the sacrifice. When that love is missing, no amount of giving will fill the void. I learned that too late with Daniel, but I hope someone else will hear it in time. So here I am at 64, a woman who has walked through fire and come out scarred but unbroken. My story isn't neat or pretty. It's messy, raw, and painful. But it's mine. And if it means anything at all, let it be this: you are more than what others take from you. You are worthy of love that doesn't ask you to destroy yourself. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you. Your time, your heart, your attention, it matters. If my journey has touched you in some way, I hope you'll share it, because we never know who else might be standing at the edge of betrayal, wondering if they're strong enough to walk away. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe if you want to walk with me through more stories like this. And please leave a comment below. I read them all, and maybe your words will be the spark that helps someone else feel less alone.